Hello, and welcome to week 9 of English 213. This week we're going to be talking about Shakespeare's sonnets. I'd like you to begin by watching this lecture, then read Renaissance Love and Desire, pages 1000 to 105. Then I'd like you to read the whole section on Shakespeare's sonnets, pages 1170 to 1186. I will be talking about your first paper, but the assignment will not go up until later this week. But it will be due November 3rd. So let's talk about the Renaissance sonnet craze. This happened in the 1590s and really began with the poetry of Sir Philip Sidney when he wrote Astrophil and Stella. Then most of these poems were based on Petrarch's model, which he set forth in rime sparse, which means scattered rhymes. But Petrarch lived in 1304. He lived from 1304 to 1374 in Italy, and he was known as a scholar during his lifetime, but his poems didn't reach the level of adornment that the level that the tutors really had of adoring his work. That didn't happen during his time. What was spectacular for the Elizabethan poets about Petrarch's poetry was how they compared rhetorical display with personal experience. So Petrarch wrote for 4 decades. He wrote over 366 poems, most of which were sonnets, written in the Petrarchian form, for one woman named Laura. And after she died midway through this, and he kept writing, because writing about Laura and his love for Laura became almost a spiritual quest for Petrarch. And by writing about his love for her and comparing her to a doe in the meadow, comparing his love for her like being lost at sea, this gave him a way to understand his existence. The themes that are included in Petrarch's work are using opposites to describe the experience of love. And this is actually a Roman poetic motif, which was derived from the Greeks. So someone like the poet Sappho actually wrote in this method, the fact that you had to put opposites together in order to describe something as undescribable as of love. The word in Greek that describes what love is like is called sweet bitter. It's like our bittersweet, which means that first it's sweet and then it's bitter, right? The melancholy afterwards. His poems also examine a lover's solitude and the melancholy one feels from that. And they focus a lot on the act of blazon. Blazon is when you describe just a part of a lover, like, and there were actual motifs for how they spoke about how Petrarch spoke about, Laura's hair, her eyes, her skin. He reused the same metaphors for each and every time he referred to her, and this was reused in the sonnet craze. There's a really funny picture on page 101, which shows a parody of the conventional descriptions of sonneteers' mistresses, and it shows what a woman would look like if she was really made up of all of the different parts that are described in the poem. But it was a way of taking the power away from a woman, like just admiring her on a pedestal. And Shakespeare really makes fun of this conceit in his sonnet 130, which you'll be reading this week. Here's an example of a poem from Rime Sparse. This is Canzoniere 173. This is sonnet 173. And you'll notice that the line breaks. This is a sonnet, which is a 14-line poem, but when it's translated, the lines are not consistent. So when you translate something, you leave it in its prose format. Gazing at the clear sun of her lovely eyes, where there is one who often makes mine red and wet, my weary soul leaves my heart for its earthly paradise. Then, finding it so full of sweetness and bitterness, it sees that whatever is woven in the world is cobwebs, and it complains to love, whose spurs are so hot, whose bite is so hard. Between these two extremes, so contrary and mixed, now with frozen desires, now with kindled, it stays thus half miserable and half happy. But few happy thoughts, and many sad ones, mostly it repents of its bold enterprise. Such fruit is born from such a root. So if we turn to the sonnets that we're going to be looking at today, we want to look at Shakespeare's sonnets. So Shakespeare's sonnets, and I really encourage you to read the biography found on pages 1564 to 1616, so you really get a background on who Shakespeare is. I will be talking more about that next week when we're talking about King Lear, but it's really important that you read this biography because it may be different than your perception of Shakespeare. The sonnets that Shakespeare wrote are unlike the sonnets from the sonnet craze, the ones that are really set up to be imitations of Petrarch. The first way that they're different is that Shakespeare addresses a beautiful young man rather than a lady in his poetry as his object of love, and also a dark, sensuous, sexually promiscuous woman. These lovers aren't very, the speaker isn't very Petrarchian. There's no despairing lover in these poems. I mean, the lover does experience melancholy, but that's not the theme. That's not why these poems are written. And often these poems are very, very tightly packed with wit, and you really have to pay attention to what words mean to understand them. So there's something you read slow and you savor. They're not as difficult to unpack as Spenser's Fairy Queen, but they are very dense, and it's important to pay attention when you read them. Look up every word you don't know. Try to really slow down and savor them. So sonnets, it's a sequence. The poems were written in the way for a patron, which is how things were written during this time period. Aristocratic patronage was how you were supported as a writer. So you would always dedicate your sequence or your book to whomever had paid for its production. And it's most likely that these poems circulated in manuscript form for many years before they were actually published. So in this sequence, we have really three different sections. The first section are the introductory series, and these celebrate, this is sonnets 1 through 17, and these celebrate the beauty of a young man, and they urge him to marry and have children who will bear his image. So the idea of celebrating how beautiful he is and asking him to continue his beauty and other, by getting a wife and having babies. Sonnets 18 through 126 are passionately focused on the same beloved young man, but the theme is of the destructive power of time, and that the destructive power of time can only be countered by love and the permanence of poetry. And the poem that we're going to be looking at today is actually the first one in that series, in that section, that you've probably heard of before. It's Sonnet 18, Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day? So we're going to look at that in just a second. The last section, Sonnets 127 through 152, focus on the dark lady as an object of desire. This is the mistress that comes up later in the poems. So let's look at what it means to explicate a Shakespearean sonnet. Explicate means to closely read and understand a poem by looking at its form and content. So this is a sonnet, it's a Shakespearean sonnet. That means it's a 14-line poem, and that there are 10 syllables per line. The rhyme scheme that means how it rhymes at the end of the line is AB, AB, CD, CD, E, F, E, F, G, G. So if you look down the right-hand side where the colored words are, you'll see what I'm talking about. So A, B represents the words day, temperate, May, date. So day and May are A's, and temperate and date are B's, and they rhyme with each other. Shines and declines rhyme, dimmed and untrimmed rhyme, fade and shade rhyme, oust and grossed rhyme, and see and thee rhyme. The structure is it's in 3 different quatrains, which is a 4-line stanza or group of lines. Most of these poems do not break. There's no line break between the 4 lines, but there's a thought break. So there's a difference in thought between each quatrain. So each quatrain kind of develops a single idea, and then when you go to the second one, it's developing another idea. And then at the end, there's a final rhyming couplet that usually offers a turn or a new way of looking or thinking about what has been explored in the poem. This can also be called a volta. The word is volta. So I'm going to read this to you and talk a little bit about what this poem means. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. Sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines, and often is his gold complexion dimmed, and every fair from fair sometime declines, by chance or nature's changing course untrimmed. But thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou oust, nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou rowest. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. So the real themes of this poem, right? It begins with this casual utterance. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day, right? And we know that yes, you shall. That's the whole point of the poem, right? The beloved in this poem completely depends on the poet, and the poet depends on the culture to keep telling the story of the poem, right? Reading the poem. So the concept of this poem is nature versus art. The idea that yes, the beloved, the young man that this poem is written for, is going to die. In fact, that person is now dead. But look, how many centuries later we are still, or how many centuries later we're still reading this poem. That it's still being consumed by our culture, so that this boy or this man is continually remembered every time we read this poem. It gives life. So so in the final couplet, so long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. You see that conditional statement that this poem will give life to the beloved as long as it exists. It's probably one of the most famous poems from this sonnet sequence, but it's important to look at it as a model of how most of the poems in this sequence are structured. So now what I'd like you to do is to look at after reading the sonnet sequence, I'd like you to closely read sonnets 29, 55, 60, 73, 116, 130, and 135. And I'd like you to read it first, so I'd like you to explicate it. So first look at the rhyme scheme, right? Look at how the A, B, C, D, how that works, okay? Look at how many lines there are. Make sure there's 10 syllables per line, right? There isn't always, those things aren't always there, right? Then I'd like you to think about what this poem means. What is it about? you're also gonna want to look at it as, as a separate poem, and then I'd like you to think of it as part of the sequence. You're gonna want to read a few of the sonnets that precede it and a few that follow your choice. So we know the poem we just read, 18, begins a part of, a sequence, a part of the sequence of poems. Then I want you to say, do other poems in the sequence clarify the meaning? So I want you to tell me the meaning of the poem as a separate poem, and then I want you to tell me the meaning of the poem as it relates to the rest of the sequence. Try to look at the poem deeply. So don't just give us an overview like I've given you the main theme of the poem. I want you to tell me what each quatrain means, and what turn is happening at the end, at the couplet. Try to really think about it and try to understand that poem in detail. I will also be introducing later this week, I'll be posting information about paper number 1. It's not going to be due until November 3rd. It's the first of 2 papers. Your last paper will be due the last week of class. The paper essentially will be a 5 to 6 page paper on a poem or a section of a play, and I will give you that information later this week. But what you're going to be asked to do is an explication, and to use your explication, that's why we've been practicing it these last 2 weeks, as a way to really talk about the period, as a way to talk about themes in British literature. So I really want you, the way that we've been thinking throughout this entire class, I really want you to think about how this all fits together. Alright, so that's it for this week. Next week we will only be reading King Lear. It's a big reading, but in case you have extra time this week, you can start reading King Lear. There will be a quiz next week, and there will be more information on preparing and writing your paper. That's it. I look forward to seeing you online. Please, as always, let me know if you have any questions.